Today's the day I'm gonna rank every Sicilian there is, and I guarantee it, I'm gonna anger some people. The Sicilian is one of the best responses against pawn e4, but it has many different ways to play, and these range from my absolute favorites to terrible abominations of openings. Before we get started though, this video was sponsored by Chess Titans. This game is awesome. It's a brand new twist on the chess we know, where you can swap out your pieces for brand new ones with different movesets and abilities. Here I swapped out my queen for this cool hydra with more moves, and here my boring old rooks for catapults, and my knights for birds. That's the best thing I have ever seen. It gives a whole new strategy to the game of chess, and is very fun, and helps you get better at actual chess because you need to think in new ways you never have before. You can download Chess Titans for free on the App Store or Google Play Store by using my link in the description. You can even find me on there, and I'll accept everyone's friend requests and maybe even play a couple of games too. Thank you to Chess Titans for sponsoring this video. At number 187, I have the absolute dumpster fire. That is the King David's opening. This comes after we go pawn to e4, black goes pawn to c5, the Sicilian defense, and of everything we could play, we go king to e2. I'm sure King David was a good guy, but regarding chess, he is an absolute because seriously, king e2, let's call it what it is, this is a bong cloud and not a good one, because there is seriously nothing redeeming about this opening. You're blocking out your pieces, you're delaying development, your king cannot castle and on e2. I don't even want to look at this anymore. This is an embarrassment to humanity, and let's hope the next one's a little better. Number 186, the Yates variation, comes after we play knight to f3, black goes knight to c6, the old Sicilian variation, we now play d4, they capture, we capture back, quite standard so far, they will take, and here we go knight to c3, black goes d6, and here we play I don't even know what to say about this move, bishop d3, which if you do not see it right off the bat, this straight up blunders our knight on d4. There's no trick here or anything. You're literally just losing your knight on move 6 for absolutely nothing in return. Like the last one, this is a disgrace to humanity, and I really hope the next one's better. Number 185, the Federico variation, comes after white plays knight to f3, we go g6, they play d4, and here we now play f5. This move is just really bad. There's no point. After white captures, we have two options here. We can try to take back, but now we have an insanely horrible kingside weakness. There are so many ways that white is going to get their queen in here and just straight up checkmate us, and that is just, like, there's no reason to allow this. The other way we can play, I guess, would be some kind of gambit with maybe, like, knight f6, but this also sucks. After, like, takes and we take back, we're down a pawn, our pawn structure sucks, our king is really unsafe, and we have gained absolutely nothing. Number 184, I have the Polish gambit after white plays knight to f3, and here we now play b5. This one is less bad, and more so, there's literally just no point here. b5 is not a very useful move because white can just capture. We're now down a pawn for basically nothing. I guess maybe bishop b7, and this is attacked, I guess, but like d3, white is incredibly solid, we're down a pawn, and we have gained, once again, absolutely nothing. Number 183, I have the Amazon attack, which happens after we go queen to g4. This move just sucks. It does not attack anything, it's not defended. It walks right into the path of black's bishop, so like d5. We are just asking for trouble here. There's absolutely no point to be doing this. And yeah, this move just sucks. Number 182, I have the Jalalabad variation after white plays knight to f3, and we go pawn to e5 here. This is basically just a gambit and a very bad one. After white captures, we have gained nothing from the pawn sacrifice. We also now have a bunch of weaknesses because c5 and now d5 is extremely weak, and everything sucks here. We're down a pawn for nothing. This is, once again, a trash opening. 181, I have the Mongoose variation after white plays knight to f3, and we go queen to a5 here. It's not like a horrible move, but there's no point to it. Like, the only thing it does is, I guess it pins the d2 pawn to the king, but this is such a non-threat. Well, I can go knight to c3, that is now completely gone, and we have gained absolutely nothing in our position, and our queen in a5 will only be a target later on. 180, I have the Kotov gambit after knight to f3, we play pawn to d6, white goes pawn to g3, and here we play pawn to b5. It's kind of like the Polish gambit, but yeah, sacrificing the pawn here, it just doesn't make sense. It is slightly better because after captures, we can play bishop d7, and like, I guess if they trade, their structures are now a little awkward because there's no bishop, but I mean, they can just as easily just like back up, go here anyways, at which point they're just up a pawn, and our position isn't horrible, but there's no reason to ever play this. 179, I have the Grob variation where we play g4 here. It's just a very bad move. It completely destroys our king side. It's not like as bad as it seems, honestly, but it's definitely not good. Number 178, I have the double Dutch gambit after knight to f3. We go pawn to f5 here, which is a different gambit I will get to. They capture, and here now knight to h6. It's knights developing to the rim like this are very, very rarely good, because while it is like capturing the pawn back, I guess it's just not worth it. White can do two things here. One, they can just play a move like d4, knight to c3, just let us have the pawn back, because now they just have a way better position. Plus, even here they can take the pawn and there's still up a pawn, and yeah, our position sucks. Or they can play the complete savage move here, knight e5, because if we capture, then queen h5, and we're literally getting checkmated. So you can see why this is so bad, but to be fair, from knight h6, if we play very well, we will get out with a mediocre but albeit okay position. Number 177, the Brooklyn retreat variation, happens after white plays knight to f3. We go knight to c6, bishop b5, the Rossolimo, and here, of all the things we could do, we back the knight right back to b8. Nothing against the people in Brooklyn, but if you live there, you are extremely dumb, and this is the proof, because what is this? Knight back to b8, like, it doesn't ruin our position, but this is such a waste of time to the point where nobody should ever play this, because there's just no point. Number 176, I have the brick variation where we play knight. I don't even know what to say. F this variation. Number 175, the Santa Cia variation, comes after we play pawn to b4, the wing gambit. Black captures, and here, of all the moves, we play c4, which just is not a very useful move. I guess the idea is, oh, you're tempting black and they're taking en passant, which is good for us. But if black is smart, they'll just play a very reasonable e5, just get their pawn in the center, and even though we are controlling d5 well, they're equally controlling d4 very well, and because of that, we really have no advantage. I mean, bishop b2 here, knight c6, everything black has is defended. We're now down a pawn with really nothing to show for it. Number 174, I have the Brussels gambit after knight to f3, and we go f5 here. It's not horrible, but it's not very good either. After white captures back, we go knight to f6, and we're probably going to get like d5, maybe win the pawn back, and we get an okay position, but it's just not that good for us. Our king is now a lot weaker for the rest of the game, and we don't really get anything. White can very easily here play like d4, and after d5, they can play check, knight c6, and they castle. We just have a much unsafer and not that great position. Number 173, I have the Nemeth gambit after we play knight to a3, which is already not good. Black now goes knight c6, and we gambit a pawn with d4. They capture, and here we now play bishop c4. It's just, there's not really a point here. It's kind of like a gambit to nowhere. We're down a pawn. I guess we get one extra piece developed, but f7 is not weak at all in the Sicilian. Black can very easily go like knight f6 here, and we're just kind of struggling. It's not like we're lost, but it's not good. Number 172, I have the Myers attack with h4. It's just not good. I mean, h4, I guess the idea is maybe h5 and h6 so we can get some attack, but move 2, it's way too early, and plus it also damages our king side because anytime we castle here, h4 is just bad for us. It's not horrible, but it is certainly not good either. And number 171, I have the Myers attack with a4. It's a little bit better because it doesn't damage to the king side, but it is equally useless. There are just so many better moves you could play. Why a4? Because in this case, you're not really going to go a5, a6, so there's less of a point. Number 170, the Grob attack, comes after we play knight to c3, the closed Sicilian, knight to c6, and here we now play g4. Once again, it just does not work. It permanently damages our king side. It is slightly better here, and we can probably castle long, which would make g4 not a horrible move, but move 3, way too early and way too big of a commitment. It is a very bad move. Number 169, funny number, I have the Franco-Sicilian variation. After knight f3, we go knight c6, d4, and here we now play pawn to e6. It doesn't look that bad. The idea is this bishop now sees the pawn, so if they capture, we can take back the bishop, which would be good for us. The problem is if they spot pawn to d5, we are not doing well here. Our knight is attacked, but after like captures and captures, we can only really back up to like b8, which after d6, we are getting absolutely murdered here. I mean, like knight f6 and queen e2. We have no choice but to play bishop e7 and lose a piece, which is just terrible. Or we can play knight into d4 here, but after captures, and captures, we're down a pawn for basically nothing. But to be fair, after we play like knight to f6, we don't have a horrible position, but it's not that good either. Number 168, I have the Bucker variation after knight to f3, and here we play h6. I don't even know what to say. I guess it prevents pieces from coming to g5, but it's basically just a waiting move in a position where we have no reason to wait. Number 167, I have the Scherzer variation after white plays pawn c3, the Alapin. We now go knight to f6. White plays e5. We go knight to d5, d4, e6, and after knight to f3 here by white, we have a couple good moves, namely trading or playing d6, but the move here is not good is knight c6. A lot of people play this because most people will just go bishop e2 here and just try to castle, at which point we just have an okay position. But if they find c4 here, we are in a world of pain because our knight is now attacked. We have to drop it back, and here now d5, and I mean captures. We are getting absolutely mauled here, and our knight has really no good escape squares. We probably have to back up to b8, and here now after bishop g5, white is already winning, so you can see how bad this can get super fast. Engine says there's some way to survive, but I still think it sucks. 166, the Cole Sicilian Gambit. This one's a bit weird. Comes after we play pawn to d4. Black captures the Smith-Morra Gambit, and here we take back with the queen, which is not a great move because knight c6 and we are attacked. However, we're going to back right up to d1, knight to f6, attacking our e-pawn, and here we play bishop c4. This is just letting them capture, and if they do, if we try to actually play in like gambit fashion with knight f3, then this is really not that great. e6, black just has an incredibly solid setup. We don't really like have any goals in mind. However, we do have a trick here. We can play bishop takes f7 check, king takes, queen to d5 check now, and after e6 and captures, material is even. However, the king being an f7, it's not like in danger at all, and black here can very easily go d5, and already they have the advantage. It's not great, it's not horrible. Let's move on. 165, another weird one. I have the Zaitsev defense. After knight f3, we play d6, they play d4, we capture, and they take back the queen, the check over defense, which is not great. We can now play knight c6 to attack their queen, but white can play bishop b5 and pin us, and any sane person here would go bishop d7, just undo the pin. The Zaitsev is queen d7, which is just, why undo the pin with the queen instead of the bishop? I have no clue. White can now just play like queen a4 here, just drop the queen back to like d3. This is now extremely awkward, and we just have a pretty mediocre position. 164, I have the Marshall Gambit. After knight c3, we go e6, d4, and here instead of capturing, we play d5. We try to introduce chaos in the center, but it doesn't go well because white can very easily capture. We take back. They will capture on c5, we take back, and then they take the pawn on d5. And at this point, we're probably just going to get some type of endgame here, where we're down a pawn, which is just not what we want. Our only try otherwise would be maybe d4 to attack, but knight b5 takes, and bishop f4, and now we got all these problems, and there's just no reason to deal with this. 163, I have the retreat variation after knight f3, knight to c6, we play d4, the old Sicilian, they capture, we recapture, knight f6, attacking the pawn, knight c3 defending, and here black tries e5 attacking us, and we simply back right up to f3. It doesn't seem that bad, but the problem here is bishop b4, and this pin is pretty brutal because now e4 is extremely weak. Our only way to really defend would be bishop d3 here, but after captures and captures, now we have a very bad pawn structure. Black just castles, and yeah, our position is pretty miserable, and we don't really have any reason to play this. 162, I have the Acton extension after knight to f3, we go g6, c4, and here we now play not bishop g7, but bishop h6. It doesn't make you lose immediately, but you can tell how good this is just by looking at it. 161, the Spielmann variation comes after knight f3, knight c6, d4, we get the central trade, knight to f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, and after d6 here, we play the very odd move, just backing up to e2 of this knight. I don't really know what the point of this is. The knight isn't threatened in the center, it is perfectly defended, and here it's now blocking in the bishop. It's just an awkward move, it's not horrible, but just why would you play this? Number 160, the Nimzo America variation comes after knight to f3. We play knight c6, d4, capture, capture, and we play d5 here. This move tries to strike in the center, and really all will happen is we're going to get an endgame. You have a couple ways to get it. The most common is captures, captures, pawn takes, we must take back, queen takes, we must take back, this check, we must block, and this trade. Engine says we are slightly better, but black scores horribly here. Make of that what you will. I think this variation isn't that great. 159, I have the Kronberger with knight to a3. It's not horrible, it doesn't ruin your position, but just why would you go to a3 instead of c3? I have actually zero idea. 158, I have the Schlechter after knight f3, black goes knight c6, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight c3, e5, attacking our knight, and we back it up to b3. This is very similar to the retreat variation where we instead went to f3 here. It is slightly better, but it has the same pitfalls. Bishop b4 here, the pin is annoying, our pawn is weak, and after like bishop d3 and this trade, our pawn structure sucks and black has an easy game. It's slightly better than the other one, but still not that great. 157, I have the Sozin attack after knight f3, e6, the French variation, d4, central trade, knight f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, black goes d6, and here we now play bishop c4, which on the surface doesn't seem that bad, but it's really probably the worst square for the bishop, simply because one, it's looking at granite, e6 is not falling anytime soon, and two, black can go a6 and a very quick b5, which is very annoying. Our bishop is now attacked. They can also potentially play b4 in the future to attack our knight, bishop b7, and this is actually a lot more annoying than it looks. Even from back here though, white scores pretty terribly in all of these variations. 156, the San Francisco Gambit comes after knight f3, knight to c6 here, bishop b5 Rossolimo, black now plays knight a5, which is very, very rare, and here now b4. This gambit isn't horrible, it's more just weird, it's very rare, b4 doesn't really help us, and after like captures, a3, I guess this is a bit dangerous, but I mean e6 and this trade doesn't really favor us that much. 155, the Katalimov comes after knight f3, and we play b6 here. It's just weird, it creates light square weaknesses. I suppose we can play bishop b7, it just doesn't really fit in the Sicilian that well. 154, the Kopech system comes after knight f3, black goes d6, and now bishop d3. It's not as bad as it looks because after like knight f6, we can castle and then eventually play c3, drop our bishop back and maybe play d4 and get a half decent position, but bishop d3 is still not a good move. 153, the quiet system comes after knight to f3. Here black goes a6, the O'Kelly, and we play d3 here. It's not a horrible move, it's just quite passive, and you have a lot of other things that will be better to do first, but overall, 152, I have the burn variation after knight f3, d6, a lot of moves for this one, d4, captures, knight takes, knight f6, knight c3, g6, dragon variation, bishop e3, bishop g7, f3, the Yugoslav, castles, queen d2, knight c6, bishop c4, and here we now play a5. It's not a bad move. The idea here is that in most of these variations, white castles long, so you get kind of a preemptive a5 to go a4 and a3. It's just not that great though. A more worthwhile move would just be bishop d7 or knight e5. By playing a5 so early, one, we create a gigantic hole on b5, which white is already controlling, and two, that kind of scares them off from castling long, which kind of goes against why we played this. So overall, it's okay. 151, the Marshall counterattack comes after knight to f3. We go pawn e6, French variation, d4, and here we play d5, striking the center and attacking their e4 pawn. The problem with this one is we just don't really get that much opportunity. After captures and captures here, while we have an okay position, the game is entirely in white's hands. They can play bishop b5 and check us. They can play c4 and blow up the center, which will favor them. And yeah, we're not doing bad, but we're really not doing great either. 150, I have the Barman exchange after c3. Here we play d5, captures, we take back with our queen. This is the Barman defense of the Alpin. d4, captures, we play knight c6 and attack, and white plays knight to f3, and here we now play bishop g4. Honestly, the biggest problem is that people don't know how to play this. Most common line here is bishop e2, we play e6, and after knight c3, what we should do here is play a move like queen back to d7, which is kind of sad, but it's what we have to do. If we play bishop b4 here, the problem is after castles, and now because of this we want to trade, this diagonal is literally murder. From the white side, I have won so many games like this, and from the black side, it's alright, but it is still very tricky, and in my opinion, just not that great. 149, I have the hedgehog variation from the Con Sicilian after knight f3. We play e6 here, d4, captures, and a6 is the Con variation or Con Sicilian. But after white plays c4 here, we play g6. This is the hedgehog. The hedgehog can be very good, but the problem is we have put all of our pawns on light squares. That means two things. One, our light square bishop is really bad, and two, we have so many dark squared weaknesses. If white is normal, you probably won't get too punched for this, but if they know what to do, oh my god, you're basically already lost. 148, I have the Swiss cheese variation, very similar, comes after knight f3, we go e6, d4, trade in the center, a6 is the Con variation. White now plays bishop d3 here, and we play g6. Yeah, only difference is this bishop is on d3 instead of c4, which favors us slightly, but it still has all the same problems. 147, I have the Zollner gambit after knight f3, knight c6, d4, trade in the centaur, g6, the accelerated dragon, bishop e3 here, and we get a lot of theory. Bishop g7, bishop e2, knight f6, knight c3, castle, d6, f4, queen b6, and in this position we now get e5. It's like an okay gambit. The point here is that if they try to take on b2, you can always trade and then eventually capture something else, and you usually have some way out. If we're looking at this purely objectively, we would probably go a little higher, but I mean, let's be honest, you're not really going to get this almost ever, and so this is where it's going. I would say sorry, but I don't think a single person actually defends this opening. 146, the Luma variation comes after knight f3, black goes knight c6, d4, the open Sicilian, capture, knight to f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, d6, here we play bishop e2, black now goes e5, the, I think he's a Boleslavsky variation, I think that's how I say it, and here we actually trade. These exchange variations are almost never good in the Sicilian because after black captures back, we don't have a bad position, but it's not great for us. This trade only favored them. Then I'll have the open b file plus d5 is going to be more powerful in the future for them. I think this position is the definition of a 5 out of 10. 145, I have the Abraham's Gambit. After b4, they capture, and now bishop b2 here. It's just a little slow. It doesn't really put black under any pressure, and they can go e6 here. The pawn's defended, and they don't really have any problems. And our position is pretty We can go knight f3 though, bishop e2 castle, and probably get an okay game. 144, the Hallis Gambit comes after we play d4, black captures, and now we can play f4 here. The thing here is that black's pawn is very weak, but f4 just doesn't really help us. We don't really need to capture the space, and black can go d5 here, counter strike in the center, at which point we're not really doing that great, but here we can still go queen takes, e6, and we're doing fine. 143, the Bowdler attack comes when we play bishop c4. This is probably the worst square for the bishop because black can go e6, and eventually they'll play d5, which will hit our bishop, and that is going to be pretty brutal for us. And along with that, there's just not really much of a point to it. Playing either knights or really a lot of other moves would just be better. Starting with the bishop just doesn't make much sense. 142, I have the exchange from the accelerated dragon after knight f3, knight c6, d4, capture, capture, black now plays g6, the accelerated dragon, and here we trade their knight. It's just not that great. Our knight can stay in the center perfectly fine here, and when we do this, black captures back with the b pawn, and they now have the open b file, and they can play d5 more powerfully in the future. Yeah, we can play like bishop c4, and we're still doing fine here, but there's just not really a point. 141, the Vitalins variation comes after we play knight f3, d6, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight c3, and e6, marking the Scheveningen variation. And here we now play bishop b5. It's just not that great. The check looks disruptive, but after like bishop d7, we don't really put black in any stress. We castle, they go bishop e7. I mean, we're doing fine here, but black is doing too, and we don't really put any pressure on them. 140, I have the McDonald attack with f4. It just takes space that we don't really need to take yet, but to be fair, if black plays like e6, we can go knight to f3, probably knight c3, and we can get kind of a grand pre-position, which would be good. But if black knows d5 here, you are probably going to be having a very bad game, because after captures, knight to f6, the tall gambit is very brutal. You're going to be doing quite bad in these variations, but otherwise you should be doing good, and so it kind of balances out. 139, I have the Heidenfeld variation. We play c3 the Alpin. Black goes knight to f6. We now play e5 attacking. Knight to the center. We now play knight f3, knight c6, and here we develop with knight to a3, which isn't horrible here. Knight a3 is actually good in a lot of Alpin variations, but it's just too premature. It would be so much more worthwhile to play a move like d4 or bishop c4 first. Starting knight a3 isn't like terrible, but just doesn't make a lot of sense. 138, the Carius variation is knight to e2. It's just an inferior way of developing. Just go knight f3. If you do misclick and go knight e2 though, it's fine. 137, the Lasker Dune attack is g3 here. This fianchetto just isn't that great in the Sicilian. It can be good in some variations, but playing it on the second move is just way too early. 136, the checkover variation is knight to f3, black goes d6, we play d4, central trade, and here instead of taking with the knight, we take with the queen, which is just unnecessary. Taking the knight is better, also runs into knight c6, which is just why. I mean, yeah, you can pin it for one move. It doesn't make queen takes d4 any more useful though. It's not doing anything. You're just putting yourself into more danger for absolutely no reason. 135, the four knights exchange is knight to f3, black goes e6, the French variation, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight to c3, black goes knight to c6 here, marking the four knights, and here we trade. It's just an okay move. After black takes back, we put the advantage in their hands and now have the open b file, and d5 is more powerful, but to be fair, here we can play e5 and put black in a bit of trouble. But after knight d5 and this trade, this is a mid position. 134, I have the floor variation, that rhymed, knight to f3. We go knight c6 here, trade in the center, and now we play queen c7. Queen c7 can be a good move in these variations, but we are just playing it way too premature. There are a lot of knight b5 ideas, a lot of knight c3, and knight comes into d5 ideas, and there's just no reason to allow this by playing queen c7 too early. 133, I have the sim again after knight to f3. We go knight c6 here, d4, trade in center, we play g6, accelerated dragon, c4, Maroxy bind, bishop g7, they back their knight up to c2, and here we play d6, they go bishop e2, and now we go knight to h6. This looks really stupid, but in this variation, it's actually not too bad, because the idea is we are supporting an f5 push. Like here we can castle, and then in like a move we can play f5, at which point we're actually doing quite well here. And while this is awesome, sadly the knight developing to the rim still isn't that good, but it can be fun. 132, I have the big clamp formation. We go d3, black goes a knight c6, we now play c3, black goes d6, and now f4 here. It's just a lot of pawns. We're taking a lot of unnecessary space, but surprisingly it doesn't work out too bad for us, but still we can't really win the game by not developing our pieces, so it sadly is not that great. 131, I have the court lever gambit when we go knight to f3, black goes pawn to a6, we now play d4, trade in the center, but here we don't recapture, we go bishop c4. It's just okay. The point is that their pawn is very weak, but after like knight c6, if we try to play in a gambit with like castles, black can just go e6, at which point our position is just okay and we don't really have any attacking ideas. And if we try to recapture, then black will once again go e6, and we don't really have many attacking ideas, and bishop c4 is just kind of a weak move because this is not looking at anything useful, so it's pretty meh. 130, I have the Kieseretsky system where we play knight to f3, black goes pawn to a6, the O'Kelly, and now we play b3 here, which proves once again to be a pretty ineffective but also kind of unharming move. I mean, after like, I don't know, e6, bishop e2 here, we're not doing bad, but this is just not the most effective way of playing. 129, I have the hyper accelerated pterodactyl defense and the exchange variation. It barely even fits on the screen so long. This comes after knight to f3. Here we play g6, the hyper accelerated dragon, d4. We now play bishop g7. They capture queen to a5 here with this check, and after white blocks with knight to c3, we go ahead and capture that. After white captures back, we take bishop d2, and we can capture one more pawn. At the end of the day, we are up a pawn, but our position is really bad. We now have a lot of dark sword weaknesses over here. Our development is really lacking, and white can very easily play bishop d3, castle, and soon gain the initiative. 128, I have the wing marshal gambit where we go b4, the wing gambit, they capture, and now a3 is the marshal variation of this gambit. The idea is if they capture, then now we can capture back right away, and this diagonal is very useful because if black ever plays like e6, we can trade, and even though we're still down a pawn, black cannot castle, which is actually pretty good for us. The problem is if they know the response here, instead of capturing like d5, we are getting pretty crushed here because of this and this. We have big problems, and we can't just capture, and then take, because then we are getting forked and losing our rook. 127, I have the Kramnik variation after we play knight to f3, black goes e6, the French variation, and now we play c4 here. We try to get kind of a Maroxy bind and control a d5, but it doesn't work out great here. It just doesn't fit the situation. Black can play something like knight c6, just develop normally, and this does not really help us that much. It does create a massive hole on d4 though, which black can try to exploit and will probably hurt us in the future. 126, I have the Marienbad Gambit from the Wing Gambit after b4. Black captures, we play a3, and black goes to d5 here, which is their best response, and we're going to capture. Queen takes back, and now we play bishop b2, marking the Marienbad Gambit. The price of one pawn for this diagonal is fine, but it's not really too great. To be fair though, if black captures again, then after knight takes back, we are already doing quite well here. But if they resist and instead play a move like e5, we're not doing that great. 125, I have the Bernard variation. After knight to f3, we go g6, d4, trade in the center. This one's really long. Knight f6, knight c3, d6, bishop, bishop, castle, castle, bunch more developing moves. We eventually reach this position where we play the move d5. It's like an okay move. We attack the center of their pawns, but the problem is we are literally never going to get this, and so because of that, it's more or less not that useful. In 124, the Stockholm attack is literally like all the same moves until we reach, oh my god, this position where instead here we're going to capture their knight, they take our bishop, queen takes, and here g4 marks the move. It does kind of damage our king side, but the attack can work. Once again, the problem is you are never ever going to get this, so what's even the point of learning? Number 123, the Kupreichik variation, comes after knight to f3. We go d6, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, and here we play bishop d7. It's just, why would you play this move first? You have so many better options here, like a6 or possibly e6. It doesn't ruin your position, but starting with it just doesn't make a lot of sense. 122, I have the Ivanov variation. After knight to f3, we play pawn up to d6, d4, trade in the center here, knight f6, knight c3, knight c6 now, this is the classical variation, bishop g5, the rouser, e6, queen d2, and here we play queen b6. We try to get this double attack on their knight and their pawn, but it just doesn't work out that well. White has a lot of things they can do. They can simply back their knight up to b3. We don't score that well here. They can simply long castle, at which point everything is defended here now too. You can go for this trade, but at the end of the day, we're not really doing that great here. But I wouldn't really call it bad either, so take it for what you want. 121, the Aronin system, comes after knight to f3. Black goes a6, and here we play bishop e2. It's not a bad move. It does develop a piece, and we can castle the next one, but it's just not that great. Playing d4 especially, or maybe c3 and then d4 is way stronger, but bishop e2 is still okay, so Number 120, the Decker Gambit, comes after we play knight to f3, black goes d6, d4, main line, trade in the center, knight f6, knight c3, black goes a6, marking the Najdorf, and here we play g4, which is a full sacrifice of the pawn. The idea is after black captures, we can now play a couple moves, namely rook g1, and after the knight backs up, bishop g5, and we now have the open g file to play with. It's not quite enough compensation, but it is some, and because of that, it is halfway decent, but still not that great. 119, the Dorfman Gambit, comes after knight to f3, black goes d6, bishop b5 here, the Moscow attack, knight c6, we castle, bishop d7, queen e2, g6, and here we now play e5. We try to launch the pawn center, try to get some stuff open. Really, it doesn't work that great. Black has a lot of good options here. Namely, they can simply capture. We can now try to trade here, takes and knight takes, but this is not scary for them at all. They can go like queen d5 here, threaten a checkmate, and after we trade, and we're fine. Like, we're not down a pawn, but black is going to have absolutely no issues here, and our position is pretty mediocre. Number 118, the Jurassic variation, comes after white plays knight to f3. We go e6, d4, and here we play a6. A lot of these a6 variations are underrated, but not this one, because white, instead of capturing, can simply push up the d5. And after this trade, we kind of get a Benoni, which doesn't really favor us that much here. After d6, we're probably still fine, but it's a pretty ant position. 117, the Staunton-Koshrin variation, comes when we play pawn up to c4. The idea is we really control d5, but the problem is now d4 for us is extremely weak, and after like knight c6, knight to f3, yeah, even though we are controlling d5, it doesn't matter because of how bad this is. Black can go e5 here. We are really never going to get this square back, and trying to get any advantage from here is basically impossible. 116, the Karlov Kramnik, comes after knight to f3, knight c6, knight c3, e5 here, taking central space, bishop c4, bishop e7, d3, d6, and here white plays knight back to d2, trying to play castles, and then f4, where we can play the very tricky bishop g5. The point here is we are very directly preventing f4. The problem is it's just not that permanent. White here can play a couple of good moves, namely knight to f1. We now have this, and we're basically forced to trade, and after the rook takes back, knight f1 isn't that awkward because they will very quickly just go like knight e3, castle, get their knight into one of the central d5 squares, and at this point we're not really doing that great, but it's still okay. Van 15, the Moroxy variation from the dragon, comes after knight to f3. We go knight to c6 here, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight to c3 here, g6, a lot of theory, bishop, bishop, castle, castle, bishop e3, d6, knight backs up to b3, bishop e6, f4, and here we now play knight to a5. It's a bit odd looking and rare, but the idea here is good. You one, open up the c file for your rook, and two, you're going to place either your knight or more likely your bishop onto the c4 square, which could be good for you. The problem I have is honestly it's just a bit too niche. One, you'll probably never get this, and number two, it's really just a decent move. It's not anything more than that. 114, I have the Gloria variation after c4. We go pawn to d6, knight to c3, knight c6, white plays g3, and here we go h5, just I want to attack you, and I mean, it's alright. This attack really isn't that scary, but to be fair, a lot of people will play something like bishop g2 here, and after h4, we can potentially go h3, which could be good for us, but it's still not that great, and we're delaying our development by going h5, h4, which is not smart. So overall, it's pretty okay. 113, the Snyder is pawn to b3. It's not a bad move. It's really just kind of mediocre. The bishop doesn't really belong in diagonal after like knight c6 and bishop b2 here. It's fine, but black can really easily defend this, and it's not really a big problem for them ever. So it's a slower way of playing that for you might be a little better, but for me I think is pretty mediocre. 112, the name is a bit confusing. I have the dragon variation from the Richter Rouser after knight to f3, knight to c6 here, d4, capture, capture, knight to f6, knight to c3 here, d6, and after bishop g5, the Richter Rouser, here we play g6, essentially saying, yeah, I know this isn't a dragon, but I'm gonna play it anyways. And if white plays like bishop c4 here, then to be fair, after bishop g7, this is basically just a dragon. I still think it favors white a little more than usual, but it's basically the dragon. My problem is, by playing g6, white can capture an f6, and after takes back, Engine says you're doing fine here, only a little worse, but I really do not like your position. You can still go bishop g7 and castles, but your pawn structure is really messed up. d6 is a massive weakness, and you're still probably doing okay, but I see no reason to allow this. 111, I have the Western in attack after knight to f3, e6, and here we play b3. Has the same pitfalls as the Snyder, which was the exact same thing, except b3 comes on the second move. I do think it's slightly better because e6 doesn't control e5 here, so the bishop coming will be a little bit more powerful, but still, I think it's pretty mediocre, if anything, just okay. 110, the Prince Gambit comes after b3, black goes pawn to d5 here, and we play bishop b2, completely sacrificing the e4 pawn. While it looks a little stupid, it's actually pretty good. After knight to c3, attacking it, and knight to f6 defending, we can now play f3 and go into this type of gambit along with various bishop b5s and such. The engine doesn't like it that much. However, I do think it's pretty good. You can probably move your bishop out, your queen out, and long castle with a pretty good game. However, it still has a lot of the pitfalls of b3, namely it's a little bit slow and not the best way to play. But if you like this type of setup, this is probably a good gambit. 109, I have the queen takes d4 variation from the Alpin after c3, knight to f6, here we play e5, and after knight to the center, we play d4, they capture, and normally here you would take back with the pawn, and these variations are known for being okay, but some of the driest and most equal kind of boring positions that come out of the Sicilian. Instead, we can play queen takes on d4 here. It's not the greatest, but the point is we attack the knight, and after e6, knight to f3, knight to c6. Our queen's attacked, we simply move it over to e4, and it's actually pretty safe in the center. I really like where this gambit is at. We can then play g3, bishop g2, and we actually have a lot of fun play. My problem is I still don't think it's that challenging, namely black can go d6 here, which most people will do anyways, and our center is kind of falling apart and we don't have a ton of development, but I still like where this gambit's head is at. 108, I have the American attack. Football, hot dogs. After knight to f3, black goes pawn to e6 here, d4, trade in the center, knight c6, marking the Taimanov, knight c3, knight to f6. Here we play knight b, or d to b5, and black goes bishop b4, and then we launch our knight into d6. This move is odd because if black captures back, then after we take, we're doing fantastic here. We win like a ton of our games. But if black knows the better move here, king to e7, which a lot of people actually do, it's not that great. After captures and captures, the engine says equality, but we score pretty badly here. Bishop d3, we have a lot of weaknesses, but still, it's probably an okay position. 107, the Carlsbad variation, comes after white plays pawn b4, the wing gambit. We capture a3, and here we capture again. This is the Carlsbad. The point here is that after bishop takes back, although this is a bit awkward, we can simply go d6 here, and it's actually not that big of a problem. And after like knight f3, you have a couple ways of playing, the best one likely being g6 and bishop g7, at which point you're up a pawn and white doesn't have that much to show for it. You do have to worry about white having both the semi-open B and A files in the endgame and midgame. However, this is still pretty good. 106, I have the O'Kelly variation after knight to f3, and we play pawn to a6 here, which is a little bit better than it looks. Preventing b5 is actually quite the important square, but still not that great. You're not developing any pieces or doing anything that great. White can play c3 here, quickly play d4, at which point a6 is kind of a waste of time, although it doesn't really harm our position either. 105, I have the fianchetto variation from the dragon after knight to f3, d6, d4, trade in the center, knight f6, knight c3, and g6 is the dragon, and here we play g3, which is just kind of eh. After bishop g7 and bishop g2, castles and castles, we're not really making too much of a play here because this is not really that important. The bishop isn't looking anything important, but to be fair, we can still go f4 and probably get a pretty good game, but it's just not the best way to play, and it doesn't really have that much going for it, so why play it? 104, I have the wing gambit with b4. It's fun, but it's just not that great. After black captures back, they have too many ways to either keep their pawn or eventually play d5 and just strike it back out in the center. But after like knight to f3 here, d5, and we now play probably trades, and then you have a couple ways to play here, maybe d4. It's not like that great, but it's not super bad either, so it bounces out into an okay gambit. 103, the Sultus variation. This one's not even that bad, honestly. It's just super long. Knight f3, d6, d... I don't even care. We got the dragon variation, then we get a bunch of theory, and we get this position. We're kind of going on an offensive on the queen side. White is going on defensive on the king side. And here we play h5. It looks a little odd because lashing out like this kind of lets g4 be powerful, but it does prevent the attack. It's alright. 102, the Ginsburg Gambit comes after knight to f3, black goes pawn to d6 here, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, and here we play bishop c4. At first, I thought this was just a kind of mediocre gambit, but after black captures here, we can go queen h5, and black is actually kind of in a bit of tricky trouble. If they simply play a g6 here, then queen d5, and now this is troublesome. They're gonna probably lose a piece. If they try to play e6, then now we have bishop b5 check, and bishop d7, the most natural move, isn't that great because knight takes on e6 now, and everybody is pinned, so they cannot actually capture this knight. And it looks great, and it kind of is, but after queen to f6 here, we're only really going to get equality probably. This check doesn't really work because king d8, we try to capture, then queen takes f2, and our dreams collide. There's a lot going on here. Most of the time it will probably favor you, but it also favors black a good amount of time, so it's fun, but it's also very risky. 101, I don't really know how to say this, Gurgenides variation, comes after knight f3, knight c6, d4, trade in the center. I've probably said that about 100 different times. g6, c4, knight to f6, knight to c3. We take, queen takes back in the center, and here we now play d6. It's fine. The problem here is that after bishop g7, or sorry, bishop g5, and we go bishop g7, this looks good, but really we have nothing here. White can pretty easily go f3, and we have absolutely nothing scary, and because of that, our position just isn't that threatening or really like trying to get advantage. It's not bad, but it's not super great. The big 1-0, I have the 11 fish variation after knight to f3, black goes pawn to d6, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, oh man, I wish I was a fish, knight to c3, g6, and here we play f4. The idea is we take central space, and there is a big trap here. Most people play bishop g7, and here we can now go e5. We're already doing well here, but most people are going to capture. We take back, then play knight g4. The knight looks defended, but then bishop b5, and there are all sorts of problems here because if they try to block, then now we can take this guy. Black can still survive here, but they have to be very careful. My bigger problem though is that if they don't play bishop g7, if they play something else like knight c6 first, f4 is actually less useful than it looks. The central space it's controlling isn't that useful, and after like bishop e2 here, we're just doing okay. Black can now go bishop g7, and we're not really being that challenging. 99, I have the Gregoria variation. You can honestly skip this one. It's another dragon variation. It's kind of boring. Knight to f3, knight c6, d4, trade in the center. I've said that probably 1,000 times by now. Knight to f6, knight to c3, d6, bishop e2, g6, bishop e3, bishop g7, queen d2, castles, and here we long castle. It's kind of a basic position. We're fine here. The biggest problem for us is that black can capture in center. We take back with the bishop, and the bishop doesn't really belong in diagonal, it belongs on e3, so we can go and trade. Bishop e6 here by black, and we score pretty poorly, but this is a pretty boring position. It's fine, I guess, for us. I don't even know. Let's just move on. 98, I have the bird variation. Caw, caw! I have no idea why I did that. Knight to f3. Knight c6, d4, trade in the center. Maybe I'm just going insane. Knight to f6, knight c3. Here we play e5, attacking their knight. They move it to b5, d6, bishop g5 here. We go a6, knight drops back, and now we play bishop e6 here, which is an okay developing move, but it's not that great because the more popular alternative here, b5, is just better, threatening b4, putting a lot more pressure on them. Bishop e6, it's fine, but I don't think it does enough quick enough. White can now play knight c4, quickly get their knight back into the game, at which point we've kind of lost our steam. 97, I have the O'Kelly wing gambit after knight to f3, black goes a6, and now b4. It's literally just the wing gambit, but slightly better because a6 is not a useful move. 96, I have the Göteborg variation, kind of sounds like some kind of alien. Knight to f3, we go pawn to d6 here, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight to c3, and we go a6. This marks the Najdorf variation. White goes bishop g5, one of the most common ways of playing, attacking our knight. We now play e6. f4, bishop e7, white plays queen to f3, getting it on the king side. We now go h6, the bishop backs up, and we play the move g5 here. With this, we are attacking their bishop and the pawns, so they're probably going to capture, and the move here is knight drops back to d7, which looks odd, but the idea is we now have this pin, so we're probably going to win the g5 pawn back. However, most people here play the more challenging approach of knight takes on e6. Point being, after pawn takes, they have queen to h5. But what is very odd here is that even though the engine gives a slight edge to white, and after king to f8, it looks very unsafe for us, somehow black wins like 65% of games here, or something really high. So high risk, high reward. If you want to go for it, you could probably win, but this is too much risk for me. 95, I have the gypsless variation after knight to f3. We go pawn to e6, d4, trade in the center, and now a6 here marks the Khan variation. White goes bishop to d3. We play knight to f6, just normal development. White castles. We go d6, c4 by white, and now we play g6. These moves aren't inherently bad, but the problem is we're not really developing enough pieces. Like, we need to get our pieces out now. We only have one piece and we're moving a bunch of pawns, and because of that, white can start to get an edge up on us. However, we should probably still be able to get bishop g7, castle, and have a fine game ahead of us. It's just not the best way to play. 94, I have the Sozin attack after knight to f3, e6, French variation, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight c3, d6, and here we play bishop c4, which once again is not usually that good in the Sicilian, and here it's fine. Black can go a6 here, and most people just castle, which actually is not that great for us because various b5s and we are kind of weak here. However, if you want to, you can preemptively back up your bishop to b3 back here. And this actually tends to work out pretty well for you. After b5, you have a couple ways to play, namely maybe f3 here is a fun way to play, or bishop e3, and this can actually go quite well. So bishop c4 is definitely not your best way of playing, but I wouldn't call it bad either. 93, the Goofeld gambit comes after knight to f3, black goes knight to c6 here, bishop b5 is the Rossolimo, g6 going to fianchetto, we castle, bishop g7, c3 here trying to get d4, black sees this and tries to prevent it with e5, however, we simply play it anyways, this being the gambit. The idea here is that after captures, captures, and captures, even though we're down a pawn, it is this pawn which is not very strong, and we can still go bishop f4 here, and soon probably try to place our bishop on d6, and even though we're down material, we have a lot more development, and overall just better position. Yes, gambit is fine. I mean, you're probably not going to get it that often, but when you do get it, it'll probably be a fun game. Black will still be able to survive pretty easily if they know what they're doing, but it's okay. 92, I have the Zagreb variation after knight to f3, d6, d4, trade in the center, knight f6, knight c3, and a6, we get the Najdorf, and here we play g3, which usually is not a great move, and here I want to call it great, but it's actually a pretty good move. After like e6 here, we can play bishop g2, bishop e7, castles, castles, and we have a fine game. It's not like the most challenging against Najdorf by any means, but it's a good, fun alternative that doesn't require too much preparation. 91, I have the Ludikov gambit after knight to f3, knight c6, and we go bishop b5, the Rossolimo, g6, we castle, bishop g7, c3, knight to f6, attacking our pawn, and here we don't defend, we simply go d4. The point here is that after they capture, we can do two things here. We can play rook e1 and just try to get the open file first, but even better is to play back here, play d5. Attack their knight, force it to move to kind of an awkward square, like backing up to b8 here, at which point now rook e1 is very powerful. Knight will probably have to drop back, and there are various ideas here of going d6, which can be absolutely brutal. Black here should be absolutely fine if they know what they're doing, so this is just a fun gambit. 90, I have the Breyer variation after knight to f3, we go knight c6, d4, trade in the center, and g6, the accelerated dragon, and c4 is the Moroxy bind, bishop g7, bishop e3, just developing moves, knight to f6, attacking the pawn, knight c3, defending, but here we play the move knight g4. Which at first may look like a blunder because this is a free knight, but the point here is that if they capture, then we can take their knight in the center. Nobody's defending it now, and after white long castles, we can drop back. We're not doing like incredible here, but we're doing fine. I would say white might be a little better, but I think our position is okay at least. A lot of people will also try to take on c6, try to trade off the knight first, but this does not work because we have knight takes on e3, knight takes our queen, knight takes their queen, and after all this happens, at the end of the day, we are actually a little bit slightly better because we've not committed any of our pawns. Then again, the endgame won't be super easy either, so I think it balances out. 89, I have the Paulsen-Basman defense after knight to f3, we go e6, d4, trade in the center, and then here we play bishop c5. The idea here is we have this diagonal, so there are going to be a lot of variations where we're going to be able to play queen to b6, and although the engine says it's about equal, it is very tricky. Black wins like 59% of games here because b2 is very weak, and when this knight moves, the f2 pawn will be hanging and various e5 ideas. Very tricky. I like it a lot. However, objectively, it's not the greatest. And other variations do this exact idea, but simply better. 88, I have the Gurgenides variation from the Rossalimo after knight to f3, black goes knight c6, and bishop b5 is the Rossalimo. Black now plays g6, we castle, bishop g7, rook e1, and black plays e5 here to prevent us from playing d4, at which point we play b4. This is essentially a kind of wing gambit, but here it is actually better than normal, because one, if they take with the knight, then now we can play bishop b2, and this is actually quite good for us because of e5. That is kind of a big weakness they're gonna have to deal with for a while, plus support c3 and d4, that good push. And also, if they take with the pawn, then we can play a3 and kind of play like this in the wing gambit style. This variation isn't as strong, but this is still a pretty fun gambit. 87, I have the Lasker Pelican variation after knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, trade and center. I really wish this was named after Pelican, like the bird, and not some guy's name. Now knight to f6, knight to c3 here, and e5 is the Pelican or Lasker Pelican variation. The point here is you are immediately attacking their knight. If they trade, then you can take back the b pawn, go d5, and this is actually quite good for you. If they back up to here, then you're doing quite well there too. The problem is if they play knight to b5 here, you play d6, and this is where stuff starts to get a little shaky. There are various bishop g5 and knight d5 options that can be quite challenging for you, but if you know what you're doing, you should still be able to get a good game. 86, the Quinteros variation comes after knight to f3, and we go queen to c7 here, which isn't a bad move. It's just kind of a weird move order. After like c3 here is their best move, trying to get d4. We can probably play like knight to f6 and still get a pretty normal game here after like a e5, knight d5, d4, and this resembles a lot of Alapin setups. It's fine. It's just kind of a weird way of playing things. 85, I have the Zen variation with knight to f3, e6, d4, trade and center, knight c6, Taimanov, and here we play knight b5. We're trying to get into these dark squares, but it doesn't work out that well because one, if they just ignore it, then this isn't actually that helpful to us. Black is pulling ahead here, and if they do try and prevent it with d6, we don't really have any attack from here. I mean, this is just completely defended with e5, so it's not bad, but it's not that great either. 84, I have the Fianchetto variation from the classical after knight to f3, d6, here we go d4. Somebody should count how many times I've said these like exact words, however many times in this video. Capture, capture, knight f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, knight to c6 is the classical variation, and here we play g3. This is another situation where g3, it's not a bad move, it's not the best either, it's just like a fine move. Black here can probably play like e6. We can go bishop g2, castle on the next move. Like, are we doing bad here? No. Is this the best way of playing? No. It's just a decent variation. 83, I have the Sokolsky variation after knight to f3, d6, and bishop b5, the Canal or Moscow attack. Bishop d7 here, main line, we trade, queen takes, and now we play the move c4. The point here is we get a strong bind on d5, and even though black can go knight c6 here, and we have a weak square in d4, it's not that bad because we can always play d4 here and we can kind of get rid of that weakness. So after like castles, g6, d4, and this trade in the center, black will soon go bishop g7, and we're not putting like a ton of pressure on them, but we're putting a little bit, and this is a pretty good variation. 82, I have the Stultz attack after c3, the Alapin Sicilian, knight to f6, e5, knight d5, knight to f3, knight c6, and bishop c4 here attacking their knight. They back it up to b6, attack us, and we back up to b3. And this variation, I don't know why it's called the attack because it's not that aggressive. A lot of these knight f6 variations are known for being basically like very dry and equal, and this one kind of falls into that category. There are some aggressive ideas, but more than likely you won't be able to get them, so it's a relatively unexciting but okay variation. 81, I have the Sveshnikov attack after knight to f3, knight c6, d4, trade, now knight to f6 here, knight c3, and e5, the Pelican, Lasker, whatever you want to call it, variation, knight d to b5 here, d6, bishop g5, pinning our knight to our queen, a6, knight drops back. Here we now play b5, the aggressive variation, and going for a b4, trying to fork them, And after this trade here, how to usually go is this trade, and now knight drops in to d5. There is a lot that can happen here. It's a very double-sided position. f5 is the best move, and this can go either way very easily. So a lot of risk, a lot of reward. If you want to go for it, it can be fun, but it can also be very, very dangerous. 80, I have the Mangiarini variation with a3. Before you write this off, I personally like this move a lot because of two things. One, if they just play a normal move, you can easily play knight c3, go into f4 and play in a kind of Grand Prix way that I really like. Or what I really like about this is if they play knight c6, you can play b4, and this is an extremely strong gambit, but completely critically, this move is simply not that good or useful. It doesn't develop a piece or do much, but I still think it actually has a lot more merit than people give it credit for. 79, I have the Pologaevsky variation after knight to f3. We play e6, the French variation, d4, trade in center, a6, con, bishop d3, and here we play bishop c5. The point here is we're trying to attack the knight and get on this diagonal, which I think has a good idea, but doesn't work too well, because after knight drops back to b3, and we drop our bishop back to a7, this isn't actually super useful. It looks fine, but after castles, we don't really have too much here. It's not like a bad move, but it's not the best. 78, I have the Korchnoi defense after knight to c3, the closed Sicilian, e6, g3, and here we go d5, and this kind of transforms it into a position that's barely even a Sicilian after captures, d4, we take, queen takes back, and now knight to f6, kind of like a reversed Scandinavian, and it's fine, but I don't really think it's too Sicilian-y or really too special either. 77, I have the Nimzovich variation after knight to f3, and we go knight to f6. If you know the Alekhines defense, it is very similar to that. After e5 here, we drop our knight into the middle, and white has a couple ways to play here, namely d4, bishop c4, pawn up to c4. It's basically a Alekhines defense now. If you like that, then it's probably good for you, and if you don't, then it's probably bad. 76, I have the Amsterdam variation from the Najdorf after knight to f3, d6, d4, trade on d4, knight f6, knight c3, and a6 marks the Najdorf, and here we play f4. The idea is we're taking some central space here. However, while it is not a bad move, I don't think it's too great either. If black just plays something like d6 here, then actually is a pretty good move. We can play bishop e2 here, and extra space is just good for us. The problem comes if they know the move e5, which is the most popular move, then this doesn't really help too much. We have to back our knight up, likely to f3. At which point black can go like queen c7 or knight b to d7, and their position is actually quite solid and we can't really break through. 75, the Sosonko variation comes after knight to f3, we go d6, d4, capture, knight takes back, knight to f6, knight c3, and g6 marks the dragon variation. Now bishop e3 here, bishop g7, f3, very standard, knight c6, queen d2, we castle, and after white plays bishop c4 here, we play knight drops back to d7. The point here is we try to open up this bishop, and simultaneously we're going to rotate our knight to b6. It's just not that useful. After white castles and we play knight b6, they can simply back their bishop up, and this maneuver isn't useless, but it doesn't really accomplish that much. 74, I have the fianchetto variation from the closed Sicilian after knight c3. Black goes knight c6, and now g3 here. It's completely fine. It's not like the best way to play, but we can quickly go bishop g2, probably f4 in the future, and we have a nice game ahead of us. And because of the nature of the closed Sicilian, the idea of g3 tends to work a little better. 73, I have the modern line after c3, and d5, the Barman defense. Captures, we take back our queen, d4, and here the important thing is that we do not trade. We go knight to f6, and after knight f3, now we play bishop g4, and this small difference of not trading actually is so much better to play for black than trading, simply because we're not letting their knight come into c3 and cause a ton of issues, and we can easily go knight c6 here, long castles. I still don't think it's the best way to play against the Alpin, but it's a pretty good one. 72 of the Lowenthal variation after knight to f3, we go knight c6, d4, trade in the center, and here we play e5. The point is we are attacking their knight and taking space in the center. That is very important. There's a few good things here. One, if they trade, we can take back the pawn. We're already doing very well here because of d5 and we have the semi-open b file. If they try to back up just about anywhere, it's also good for us. The problem comes if they know knight to b5, but here, after d6, we're still doing quite well. This will transpose into the Kalashnikov a lot, and while it is fun to play, the massive hole on d5 is quite a big issue that might never get resolved. 71, I have the Boleslavsky variation after knight to f3, d6 is very similar to the one right before this, d4, capture, capture, knight of 6 attacking, knight c3 defending, and knight c6 by us. And after white goes bishop e2 here, we play e5. You see it is very similar, has all the same ideas. Knight b5 is once again their best move. I prefer it slightly because bishop e2 is not white's absolute best way to play, but it's basically the same. Number 70, somebody definitely took a ton of drugs before naming this one. I have the hyper-accelerated pterodactyl defense. After knight f3, we go g6, they play d4, and here we don't trade, we simply play bishop g7. The point here is that after they take one, although we're down a pawn, we can always kind of win it back with queen a5 check, but the idea here is that with this, we now have this entire diagonal to play with, which will be surprisingly useful in a lot of circumstances. The problem here, though, is that we're still kind of down on development after, like, knight of 6 here, knight c3. Also, we can never play d6, or we can, but it's going to be kind of annoying. So it has some good tactical ideas, but positionally is not the best. 69, funny number, I have the chameleon variation after knight to c3, knight c6, and knight g to e2, which normally is not that great of a move, but with these two knights is actually fantastic. Simply because you can make slower moves in the close Sicilian because it is more close, and after like knight to f6 here, you can lash out in the center of d4, or you can play g3. It's actually a pretty fun system, although knight g to e2 sadly is still not the best move to play, but I do like it. 68, the Godiva variation comes after knight to f3, we go knight c6, d4, trade in center, and now we play queen to b6 here. We attack their knight in the center. Most people do two things. If they trade, you can take back with either pawn here, like if you take back with a d pawn, you can then play e5, and your position looks a little odd, but actually flows very well. And you have the open d file to play with in the future, and if instead they don't trade, they back up to b3, this is probably their best option, but here you can still go e6 and get a pretty good game. 67, I have the 4 knights variation after knight f3, we play e6, d4, trade in the center, knight f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, and here we play knight to c6. It can go a lot of ways from here, and it's not the most exciting way to play, but if you play this, you're probably not going to get a bad game. 66, I have the modern variation from the Con Sicilian after knight to f3, black goes e6, d4, trade in the center, a6 marking the Con variation, and here we play bishop d3. The idea of this is that we are predicting black is going to go b5, bishop b7, and put pressure on our e-pawn, so we are preemptively simply defending it. And this is just a good variation. There's nothing wrong with it. There's nothing too special about it. So yeah. 65, I have the Koch variation after knight f3, e6, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6 here, knight c3, and bishop b4 is the pin variation, and we go e5. Attacking their knight, their only really good move here is knight to d5. Attacking our knight, and you have a couple ways to play, but my favorite would be bishop d2. They capture, you take back the pawn, and after they back their bishop up, even though our pawn structure is basically ruined here, we have 2 extra pieces developed, and we have various queen g4 ideas, and black is going to have to deal with quite the strong attack. So I think it balances out in our favor to a pretty good opening. Number 64, the Matanovic attack, comes after knight to f3, black goes d6, d4, trade on d4, knight to f6 here, knight c3, and e6 by black, the Scheveningen, and here we go f4, which is just a fun way to play. It doesn't like stop black's plans. They're still probably going to go like a6 or knight c6 and play in typical Scheveningen style. But taking extra central space like this doesn't really have too many downsides in this position, so if you want to go more on the attacking side, this could be a good variation for you. 63, I have the Barman defense after c3 the Alapin, d5 by us, they capture, and we take back with our queen. It's a good way of playing against it, taking advantage of the fact that knight c3 cannot happen because their pawn's there now. but I still think putting our queen in the middle is just going to lead to issues later on, and for me it's made worse by the fact that the alternative here, knight to f6, is for me both easier to play and objectively better in basically everything. 62, I have the anti-English after knight to f3, d6, pawn to d4, trade in the center, knights come out, and then a6 marking the Najdorf variation, at which point white goes bishop e3, the English attack, and we play knight to g4. Defended by the bishop, we are attacking their bishop, and if they do nothing, then we can just capture, and their pawn structure now sucks. So they can do two things: they can back up and simply go for a repetition, which might be what you want or might not be, so you can think about that. Or they can try to play a bishop g5, at which point we'll get h6, bishop backs up, g5, and bishop g3. We can then play bishop g7, and it's a very strange but actually pretty good variation. It's also very double-sided, so if you want to go for this, you can, but it does have a risk. 61, I have the Spielmann variation from the dragon after knight to f3, knight c6. There's a lot of moves here, and normally I would simply write this off as another one that has just way too many moves to be useful. However, it occurs in this position where we go bishop to d3. And this is actually a fantastic variation if you do manage to ever get it, because everything is so solid here. If they take our bishop, we take back the pawn, and nobody is getting through this, and we have a big attack brewing on the king side. If they try to take our knight, we can simply take back with probably the a-pawn. If they take here, then once again we can take the pawn or even the queen now. And most people would simply play rook over to c8, at which point you can actually just take the pawn on a7. It looks like you can't because b6, but simply captures, and your bishop always has a way home. It's really unfortunate that you're probably only ever going to get this a few times. At 60, I have the Prince variation after knight to f3, d6 by black, d4, trade in the center. Our pawn is attacked with knight to f6, but here we don't defend with knight c3, we instead play f3. Which normally is either a very good move or a very bad move, and here it falls somewhere in between. Because the idea here is we defend the e-pawn like this, that way we can still play c4, put our knight behind the pawn, and try to get kind of a Maroczy bind. Sadly, black can still play moves like queen to b6 and try to exploit our weak and dark squares, but if we know what we're doing here, we should still be completely fine. 59, I have the classical variation from the dragon after knight f3, d6, d4, trade in the center, knight f6, knight c3, and g6 marking the dragon variation. And here we play bishop e2, which I want to preface is not a bad move. We're simply moving our bishop out, and we're going to castle very soon and just get a probably good position. But in my opinion, the various systems with bishop e3, f3, queen d2, and castles along always seem to be just better. More fun, more opportunities to win, and objectively better. So bishop e2 isn't bad, but by comparison, it's just not the best. 58, don't know how to pronounce this one, Venus variation, don't know how to say it, comes after knight f3, e6, d4, trade in the center, and queen b6 here marks this variation. The idea is you're not really committing much pieces, but you're pressuring their knight, the pawn behind the knight, and their pawn on b2. For example, after knight c3 here, we can go bishop c5. Black wins like a lot of games here, but if white knows the move knight to a4, they still have to play sharp. However, we're not really getting anything that good here. And that's basically how all the variations are. It's very tricky. If they know like one or two moves, they'll be fine, but most people don't know them. So essentially, if you're lower rated, this is going to be fantastic, but the higher you get, when people know what they're doing, it's going to tank very quickly. 57, I have the Morphy Gambit. When we go d4, black captures, and now knight to f3. We attack the pawn, and we're almost certainly going to win it back. It's really just tempting black to play a move like e5 and trying to get them to go in some bad opportunity. Most people will just play like knight c6 here, at which point we can take back, and this transitions into any one of the normal Sicilians. 56, I have the hyper-accelerated dragon after knight to f3, and we go g6 here. It's fine, it's basically just a dragon, and what is good about it is that we can guarantee bishop g7, d6, knight f6, and castles in basically every single game, which is good, but the problem is, objectively, it's not the best. White has many good ways to play, namely c4, going for Maroczy bind, or possibly like c3 here, and d4, and both of them will land white a small advantage, but it's still a good opening for you. 55, I have the Andrzejczyk gambit after d4, black captures, knight to f3 here attacking, e5 defending, and now we play c3 here. If you're looking at it purely objectively, this would be like top 10 because after captures and we take back, we're already basically winning here. This pawn's extremely weak, 2 pieces developed, and we have an amazing game. And if they play anything else here, then we also basically have an amazing game. And also, by the way, the reason we cannot take is queen a5 check. Don't get tricked. It would be higher, but the problem is only comes after e5, and most people know that e5 is not a good move, which really limits its use. However, this is something you should keep in mind if you do ever get e5 in this position. 54, I have the Cherniak variation after knight to f3, we go d6, d4, trade in the center, then knight f6, knight c3, and g6 is the dragon variation, and white goes bishop e3, and then f3, the Yugoslav attack, we're going to castle. Queen d2, we get a bunch more moves, they don't really matter too much. What matters is we reach this position where we go bishop e6. At first, I looked at this and thought it was bad because after they capture and we take back, our pawn structure is messed up, but it's actually pretty good because this clump of pawns is very strong, controls a lot of these important squares, and now we can play like after white castles, queen a5, rook to c8, try to open up our pieces here, and this is actually extremely solid. Is it the best way of playing? No, but it's a fun one that I like. 53, the Velimirovic attack comes after knight to f3, knight c6 here, d4, this trade in the center, knight to f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, d6 by black now, we go bishop c4, e6, kind of going for a Schweningen. Here we now play bishop e3, and after bishop e7 by black, most of the time here you would simply castle, but with this move you play queen to e2. The idea being on the very next move after black castles, you are going to long castle. And your plan here is pretty simple. You're going to start going g4, h4, h5, g5, you're going to go on some big attack. Objectively, it's not the best. Engine thinks that this is now equal for black, but it is really fun. And is also sound enough to the point where I actually really like it. 52, I have the Richter-Rauser variation after knight f3, knight c6, also literally all the same moves as the previous one until we get here, in which we go bishop g5. It's a good move, it develops a piece, but pressure on their knight, you can then go queen d2 and long castle. It's just not my favorite way of playing. I tend to find the bishop kind of starts to get in the way of any attacks that we actually have going on, but it's still good. 51, I have the Kalashnikov variation after knight to f3, we go knight c6, d4, trade in the center, we now play e5, and after knight b5 here, we go d6. There are a lot of very similar variations to this one, namely the Lowenthal. However, this is my favorite of them, simply because you keep your options very open. Let's say white goes like bishop e3, you can play knight to f6 here, or you can first play bishop e6 or bishop e7. And the other option here of first playing a move like a6 isn't actually my favorite because you allow bishop g5 and various pins. But sadly, it suffers from the same problem of the gigantic hole on d4, which white can also strengthen with a move like c4 here, and that can get bad in a lot of ways, but overall is still a good variation. 50, I have the pin variation after knight to f3, e6, d4, trade in the center, now knight to f6 here, knight c3, and we go bishop b4. We pin the knight to their king, which is now the e4 pawn's now hanging, and there are a lot of good ideas here. If white knows the move e5, this is the move that causes you trouble, at which point knight d5, and while it can get a little troublesome, if you know what you're doing, you should still be completely fine here. On the bright side, most people don't know what to do. They'll play something like a bishop d3, at which point you can very easily trade here and ruin their pawn structure, or simply go d6, and after castles, you have a good game ahead of you. 49, I have the Cobra variation after knight f3, knight c6, d4, trade in the center, knight f6, knight c3, e6, knight d to b5 here, and we simply play bishop c5. We take control of this very strong diagonal, and we don't really mind that white is getting their knight in here, because one, if they go knight to d6, you don't capture, you play king to e7, and although it is a little awkward, you're completely fine here. Bishop f4, then e5, knight to f5 check, you drop your king back. Yes, it still looks a little awkward, but you are actually doing quite well here while white moves their knight around about 40 times. And if instead they play like bishop f4 here and try to get their knight in, you can simply castle. And there's a fun trap here, knight c7, going for this, e5. Severing the connection, and there are bad things that's happening for white here. Objectively, it's not the greatest, but I still think it is really fun. 48, I have the Amsterdam variation from the dragon, which is the second Amsterdam variation, something weird going on there. Knight to f3, knight c6, d4, trade in the center, knight f6, knight c3, and eventually we reach a dragon position like this, bishop e3, bishop g7, and here the Amsterdam is queen to d2. The point here, you're going to long castle, you're going to go on some big attacks and have a lot of fun. The only thing you need to be careful here is that bishop h6 will often get dangerous, like let's say black castles, we castle, and then this, or let's say black plays this, we then go here. This doesn't quite work because knight takes on d4, captures, and this, and we have lost a piece. But other than that, as long as you don't fall for that trick, this is honestly a great variation and a fun attacking one. 47, I have the modern bishop c4 variation from the accelerated dragon after knight f3, knight c6, these unimportant moves, and then g6, the accelerated dragon, at which point we play knight c3, bishop g7, bishop e3, knight f6, then bishop c4 by us, which normally is not a great move, but here it actually is because we can always simply back our bishop up to b3, which is the best move. White scores very well here because it's now acting like a sniper on their f7 pawn, of which there are a lot of fun tactics. Look up the Bobby Fischer trap if you want a really fun one. But for us, we're still doing well here. After like d6, you have a lot of fun ways to play. You can go f3, queen d2, long castles, and go for that type of setup. That's my favorite, and this transposes into the Yugoslav attack. Or if you want to, you can simply go ahead and play a move like h3 here, and castle. That is completely fine as well. Bishop c4 is a good move. It's probably still not the absolute best, but it is very fun. 46, I have the Mora gambit, not the Smith Mora, which is the immediate d4, but rather knight f3, d6, and on the third move, d4, and it does make a difference. In this case, it's worse because after black captures, and we play c3 here. The good thing about this Smith Mora is that knight f6 is not a very good move because we could simply play e5, but here if they play this, we have to play a move like queen c2 here, and after captures and knight takes back, we don't have a bad position, but it kind of messes with our gambit setup. But to be fair, if back here, if they do just capture immediately, then we're honestly doing great here. Bishop c4, we have so many fun tactical ideas, and we're going to get a very good game. 45, I have the Hag Gambit after knight to f3, d6, bishop b5 check, bishop d7, this trade, and then we're going to castle, knight c6, c3, knight to f6 here, attacking our pawn. We don't defend, we go d4. The idea is that after they capture, first we go d5, attack their knight, force them to drop back to an awkward move like b8 or something like that, and then we go rook e1 here, and this is pretty brutal. Knight to f6, bishop g5, there are a lot of bad things that can happen to them. My only problem is that this position, while good, if they basically ignore us with like knight to a6, we can't really do much. If we try trading, then g-pawn takes back, and they're actually just incredibly solid, but it is still a very fun gambit. 44, I have the accelerated dragon after knight f3, knight c6, d4, trade in center, and then g6. The idea is you get a dragon pretty early on. You can go bishop g7, knight f6, castle with a great game. If you are like a beginner to like intermediate, this is really good. But once you start to go higher than that and people know c4, the Maroczy bind, this is where stuff gets really tough because the best idea in the dragon is to eventually play d5. And with c4, that is kind of prevented, and you might be struggling in the middle game because of that. But there are more than enough tactical ideas and funds opening to make up for it. 43, I have the brown variation after these moves, where eventually we reach the Najdorf. 43, I have the brown variation where we play all of these moves, and eventually we reach the Najdorf, then bishop g5, e6, f4 by them, getting aggressive. Now bishop e7, queen to f3, h6, their bishop backs up, and we simply go queen to c7. Not the most special move, but it is a good one. The idea here is that after like white long castles, we can go knight b to d7, and we have an unbelievably solid position. We'll likely eventually play g5 here, probably b5 and bishop b7, and we have a tight, a very compact, but also just a great game. 42, I have the fianchetto variation from the Khan after knight f3, e6, d4, trade, and then a6, the Khan Sicilian, knight to c3, b5, and here we now play g3, simply because now that black has opened up this diagonal, this g3 and bishop g2 is going to be very strong because it targets their rook. Not too much more to it, it's a very good way to play and takes advantage of black going b5. 41, I have the Taimanov after knight to f3, we go pawn to e6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, and now knight to c6 here. We attack their knight in the center. If they capture us immediately, we can take back the b pawn, quickly go d5. We have a very good game ahead of us, and there are a lot of transpositions here, meaning there's going to be a lot of shifts to the dragon, or to this variation, or this opening, or whatever. But for the more individual lines here, like knight c3 and bishop b4, none of them are bad. I want to say that you're almost always going to get a good position. However, it seems like white almost always has one or two good options that allows them to keep the lead, meaning this is probably a lot better for beginners than more advanced players, but it is still a good variation. 40, I have the Ivanchuk variation after c3 the Alpin, knight to f6, e5, knight d5, knight f3. We get a bunch more boring moves. Knight, bishop, pawn, bishop, queen, queen. And here we now play g5. In a variation known for being very boring, this is extremely fun. The idea being, one, if they capture, well, now we can take on e5 either with the knight or the queen. Both are good options. And if they try to resist with like h3, then we can now go bishop g7. And the pawn is probably going to fall either way. White is still probably fine here, but considering how much fun it brings to a variation that is not super fun most of the time, I really value it. 39, I have the perennial gambit after knight to f3, d6, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight to c3, a6, bishop e3, and e6 is the Scheveningen, at which point we go g4, very aggressive line. Well, black now plays e5, attacking our knight. We go knight to f5 here, g6 attacking us, and here we don't back up, we go g5. This is a very, very crazy variation. Black's only good move here is to capture, and now our only good move here, taking their knight is fine, but even better is taking f5, and this looks insane. The idea here is that now their knight is very, very weak. Instead of moving it, their only good move here is now d5, which is completely insane, going for d4, trying to fork us, at which point we go queen to f3, and now things are just so insane, and now their only good move here is either d4 here or possibly knight e4, and it just gets crazier. It is an extremely double-sided variation. If you play one wrong move, you're probably going to lose immediately, but on the other hand, if black plays one wrong move, then they're going to lose immediately too. If you want an absolutely crackhead variation, this one's probably for you. 38, I have the Bronstein variation after knight to f3, we go pawn to e6 here, d4, capture, capture, and then a6, the Khan variation, c4, a kind of Maroczy bind, knight to f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, bishop b4 pinning, bishop d3 defending, knight c6 here marks this variation. We are attacking their knight. First off, if they try to capture us, we can take back with the d pawn, because we'll soon play e5, and then we'll have an extremely strong control over d4, which white cannot match. And if instead they try like backing their knight up like c2, this is their best move, at which point we can take on c3, they will take back, and they now have a pawn structure that is forever ruined. Isolated doubled c-pawns are really not what you want, and here you can simply play a couple of moves, namely d6, or the best one, d5, lashing out in center, and you have a very good game ahead of you. 37, I have the Basman-Palatnik double gambit after knight to f3, d6, c3 delayed Alpin, knight to f6 attacking, but we don't defend, we go bishop e2 because if they capture, then queen to a4 check, and your opponent starts profusely crying because they have lost their knight, which is what you want, but sadly for you, they may not do that. They will instead probably play knight c6. At which point you'll go d4, they're going to capture, you take back, capture, you push up, and now they can play this check, at which point you go knight to c3. The idea of this is that after captures and captures, they can't take right yet, because then we'll go bishop d2, they're going to lose their knight. So instead they can try to play Before capturing, move their knight probably to e5, and we're simply going to castle here, because if they want to take again, we love this, because even though we're down 2 pawns, we have so much compensation, we're already basically winning. This gambit is a ton of fun. My problem with it is I find it is often very hard to convert, and like back here, if they back up to b8, or sorry, to d8 here, whilst it is a good position for us, we are down a pawn and black is extremely solid, which may not be the best for us, but there will still be a lot of fun play here, which you definitely want. 36, I have Parasipkin's Sacrifice after knight to f3, knight to c6, d4, capture, knight takes back, knight to f6, knight c3, and e5 here, attacking our knight, knight d to b5 here, d6, bishop g5, pinning their knight to their queen, a6, knight drops back to a3, b5, going for b4, trying to fork us, and after captures, they take back with their g-pawn, knight d5, f5 is a long one. Here in this position, we now sacrifice our bishop with b5. The idea is after takes and knight takes, we are getting our knight into c7. It cannot be stopped. The only way maybe queen a5, but then we simply go c3 because of captures, knight c7, and they get forked. So the best way to play here would be something like rook to a4, which is a very difficult move to find, and we can still play the check. King will probably move over. Engine says black has a slight edge here, and because our knights are a little entangled, it may be difficult, but I still like our position a lot. 35, I have the Chicago defense after d4, the Smith-Morra gambit, we capture, c3, we take again, knight takes back, knight c6, we get some good developing moves here, bishop c4, e6, knight f3, d6, castles, a6, queen 2, b5, attacking their bishop, they back their bishop up to b3, and here, we go rook to a7, a very odd looking move, which is why it's so good, because after rook to d1 by white, trying to attack this, we can play rook to d7, Engine says about equal, but black scores super well here because it's such an odd looking maneuver, but it works really well. And while after bishop f4 and knight to f6, you do have to deal with some tight and kind of lackluster development, you are so solid that to a lot, it doesn't actually matter too much because white can't really break through. 34, I have the Panov attack, not the one from the Caro-Kann, but instead after knight f3, d6, d4, trade, then knight f6, knight c3, and g6, marking the dragon, at which point we're going to go bishop e3, and then f3, the kind of Yugoslav, castles by them, queen d2, knight c6, and here the move is g4. We are making our intentions clear, we want to attack, and this direct head-on attack actually ends up working pretty well here. It is going to be pretty difficult for them to defend. The engine is suggesting h5, which is not a very human move to try and lash out against us, and if they don't do anything, we're probably going to go h4, h5 here, g5, start rolling them on the king side, and it's going to be very difficult for them to do anything. 33, I have the Portsmouth Gambit after knight to f3, knight c6, and pawn to b4. It is a type of wing gambit, but in this case, it's actually very good because they can do two things. They can try to take with the knight. If they do that, then we have c3, knight must back up, and then d4. And we're actually doing great here. We have a very big center. Their biggest try, or their best try, trying d5, and after this trade, knight c3 will then go d5, and we have so many traps here. It's actually really, really fun. And back here, if they instead try to take with the pawn, well then, now d4 anyways. Engine still prefers black very slightly, but I like our position more. It is very fun, very open, and this is exactly what I want from a gambit. Number 32, I have the modern bishop c4 variation from the dragon after knight f3, d6, d4, trade in the center, these moves, then g6, the dragon, bishop e3, bishop g7, and here we now play bishop c4. If you want me to explain these ideas, just take a look at number 47. It's all the same stuff, but even stronger, because with d6 here, that means the bishop has an even stronger path, because the only way black can block his bishop out is e6, which they don't really want to do now because then d6 would be very weak. Plus, if you like, which I personally do, you can still play f3, queen d2, and kind of go in the Yugoslav style, which I also really like, and so all in all, this is a very powerful variation. 31, I have the knight f6 variation after c3 the Alpin, and we play knight to f6. We attack their pawn, and this is the best way to play against the Alpin, because after e5 here, knight drops to the center, and d4, you can easily here just trade and then play like d6. and white really just does not have a way to actually fight against you. If you are a beginner and you get the owl pin a lot, definitely learn this. You are going to crush a lot of people, and as you go higher, you might get some more boring but still good positions that you can play out. Number 30, I have the Adams attack after knight to f3, black goes pawn to d6, d4, this trade in the center, knight to f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, and here black goes a6, the Najdorf, and now we play h3. At first, this move looks entirely useless, but the idea is that sooner or later, we're going to eventually play g4. We can even do this right away, which the engine really likes, and it looks kind of crazy, but I mean, black can't really do anything here. They can try h6, but then we'll go bishop g2, and despite this crazy looking structure, bishop 2 and everything, we are doing actually fantastic here. The engine then even likes us to play f4. It's a bit of a crazy position, but it looks really fun. We have all this pawn space, and naturally with that, it will be very double-sided. You have to play carefully, but you're going to have a lot of fun here, which I personally love. 29, I have the Jaff variation after knight to f3, we go pawn to e6, d4, trade in the center, knight f6, knight to c3, bishop b4, the pin variation, bishop d3, defending the pawn, and here we now play e5. Attacking their knight, it's actually kind of awkward on where they want to go. The most common move here is knight to f5, but this scores terribly. Black wins like 65% of games here because we're simply going to castle. After they castle too, we're going to capture. Now their pawn structure is ruined, doubled isolated c-pawn, so it's just a yuck. And now d5. And this stuff is going on, and after captures, we can then play e4, and it is a complete disaster for them. If they do know what to do, which is a different move here, not even knight to f3, this is also not very good for them. Their best move here, knight drops back to e2, at which point we can simply castle, and we still have a very good game ahead of us. 28, I have the Milner-Berry attack from the barman after c3 and d5. We capture and queen takes back the barman defense. We will now play d4 here, knight to c6, knight to f3, capture, capture, e5, striking in center. We play knight c3, attacking their queen. They go bishop b4, pinning our knight to our king so we cannot capture. And here we play the extremely calm bishop e2. And the next few moves will happen so often. They will take on d4 of the pawn to attack our knight. We're simply going to castle. No, this is not a blunder, because then we take their queen and you laugh their face and they cry a ton. Instead, they're probably going to take with their bishop. You will take back and knight to f6 here. So many people will capture again, but if you play bishop a3 here, oh my god, you win so many games because black cannot castle and they really have no easy way to actually make it so they can. All they can really try to do is take another pawn and be greedy, I guess, but then you can play queen a4 and you are going to move your bishop out, get your rook in the center, your other rook in the center too, and black all of a sudden is on a massive defense while we go on this gigantic attack, and it is extremely fun. 27, I have the Venice attack after we go knight to f3, they play d6, d4, this trade, knight f6 attacking, like this, knight c3 defending, and now e5 here attacking our knight. Instead of moving it, we play bishop b5 check. This is extremely strong because most people, about 3/4, will play bishop d7, and you can trade, they'll take back with the knight, and now knight to f5 here. d6 is very weak and it's very hard to defend, and if they try queen b6 like this, the easiest thing to do here, simply castle. And it may not look like it, but you are completely dominating here because black cannot really do anything. Here you can go queen e2, move your rook to d1, keep developing your pieces, and black just doesn't really have any way to fight back. The only thing they can really do is maybe try g6 to attack your knight, but then knight drops back to e3, and this is a gigantic outpost. You're going to land your knight on there, and that knight is going to be a god for the rest of the game. This would have gone even higher, but it can only be played when black plays pawn e5, which is not a good move, but on its own it stands extremely strong. 26, I have the Moscow Gambit after knight to f3, black goes d6, and bishop b5, the Moscow variation, knight c6, we're going to castle, bishop d7, undoing the pin, c3, going for d4, knight to f6 attacking, we defend with rook to e1, a6 now, attacking our bishop, we're going to trade, And with this threat, we don't defend, we simply go pawn to d4, because after black takes with their bishop, we're going to play bishop to g5. It doesn't look like a gigantic threatening move, but black here is on the verge of getting crushed. Because, first off, we're threatening to take their knight and then take their bishop, or really just give them an unpleasant position all around. So they're going to back their bishop up, at which point we're going to take their knight. They can't take back the e-pawn because of the pin. They have to take with the g-pawn, which is already ugly. Then we play d5. Now their bishop has to back up, which is extremely sad. And here, the best move, simply knight b to d2. Yes, black is up a pawn, but they're getting absolutely mauled here. Our position has way more space, they're extremely tight, and after queen c7 here, their only hope is to long castle, at which point you can play a4, with the idea of if they long castle, you're going to go b4 and go on this gigantic attack, and you are absolutely dominating here. Number 25, I have the Rossolimo attack after knight to f3, knight to c6, and bishop to b5 here. The point of this move is that you're putting pressure on their knight, and a lot of variations you are going to trade, and a lot of others you're simply going to keep this pressure, because that pressure actually is going to work in a lot of cases wonders. But more importantly, no matter what they play on the next move, you can basically always castle and guarantee yourself a safe and good position. You'll likely go a c3, d4, and you have a great game ahead of you. Number 24, I have the Ga-Pa variation. Don't know where that name came from. Knight to f3. We go e6, the French, d4, this trade, then knight f6, knight c3, and queen b6. This one is odd. Objectively, the engine does not like it, but the idea of queen b6 that we're putting pressure both on b2 and on their knight and this entire diagonal, and practically it is amazing. Black wins 55% of games here compared to white's 41, which is a gigantic difference for move 5. Reason being, it is very tricky for white to develop and both avoid ideas of queen takes on b2 and bishop to c5 in this diagonal, and on the bright side too, we'll basically always be able to castle safely, which is also really good. And yeah, if white knows exactly what they're doing, they will end up with a slightly better position, but I can guarantee you that almost nobody actually knows what the best moves here for white are. 23, I have the Alpin variation. This comes with c3. The idea simply being we're going to go d4 and just get a big center. At the beginner level, this thing is like an actual behemoth. It's like an elephant with like rockets and guns and also like bulletproof armor made of like obsidian. It is absolutely insane. And as you go higher, people will know two defenses that actually are good. One of them is d5, the barman defense, which I have a fantastic record against. Putting their queen in center, we can still go d4, and their queen's really just going to be a big target. Their only really good defense here for me is knight to f6. Attacking the pawn like this, at which point we'll go e5 and then d4, and although it's not the most exciting position in the world, it is a still like a good position that you'll almost always be able to castle and get a good position from. 22, I have the French variation after white plays knight to f3 and we play pawn to e6. This is less of an actual variation and more of a like you pick your adventure from here. The e6 variations tend to be a little worse than the d6 or knight to c6 variations. However, it still has many fantastic ones, which you will see later on. And on its own will usually promise you a pretty good game from the start. 21, I have the Totsky attack after knight to f3, black goes knight to c6, bishop b5, the Rossolimo, g6, we castle, bishop to g7 here, c3 going for d4, and after knight to f6 by black attacking our pawn, we defend with queen to a4, which engine says is about equal. However, it scores really good for white because everybody for black here will almost always castle, and now d4. Taking central space, and after like captures, I mean, we already have a gigantic center. If they try a6 to attack our bishop, you can play d5 here to attack their knight, take advantage of the fact that they cannot capture because then that is a free rook. If they try d5, you can then play e5, attack their knight. It must go in the center, and then you simply win a pawn here, and their bishop sucks. Their best try here is they can take on e4, which is a gambit and a good one for us because then we'll go d5 with this and this. Their only move here to not lose is knight c5. We back up to a3 to attack. Once again, their only move here to not lose is basically queen b6. You then play knight c3, And for the price of one pawn, black has a very janky position. Pieces are still attacked, there are lots of pins and stuff going on, and they have a lot to deal with. Number 20, I have the freak attack, which is really freaky, comes after knight to f3, d6, d4, captures, knight f6, knight c3, a6, the knight orf, and here we go, rook g1. I originally looked at this and ranked it a lot lower because what even is the point of this, I thought, but the point here is that after e5 by black, we back our knight up and something like bishop e6. The point is we support g4, and this looks really weird, looks like we're ruining the king side, which we kind of are, but it doesn't matter because we're going to go g5, and black is in a lot of trouble here. If they try to just fully ignore us and go like knight here, I mean g5, the knight is forced to back up, and then bishop e3, it doesn't matter that we did this because we're going to go queen d2 and long castle. Yeah, we're doing great. And if they try to prevent it with something like, let's say here they go h6 to prevent this, the most fun line here is h4. Just I'm gonna do it anyways. And I mean, you are doing absolutely fantastic here. It is very freaky, however it is also very fun. 19, I have the Moroxy bind variation after knight to f3, knight c6, d4, trade in the center, g6, the accelerated dragon, and here we play c4. Moroxy bind, I think this is the main variation of it, but it occurs in a lot of different Sicilians because the idea of c4 is we prevent black from playing d5, or at least make it a lot harder to do, and especially in the dragon, d5 is their main idea to play it eventually, and so by playing c4, this makes it a lot tougher on them. And after like bishop g7 here, we go bishop e3, our life is fantastic. We're going to go bishop e2, we're going to castle, we have a great game because black's main plan here, going d5, is basically prevented. If you hate dealing with the accelerated dragon, this is going to be a fantastic opening for you. 18, I have the Moscow variation with knight to f3, black goes pawn to d6, and we go bishop b5. This is called an anti-Sicilian because it is very different from a lot of Sicilians and is basically saying, hey, I know you want to play Sicilian, but you're going to play it how I want to play it. How this will usually go is black will go bishop to d7, you can go ahead and trade here, they'll take back with their knight, and here you can simply castle. You've already gotten a piece out, you have castled, and you'll soon play c3, d4, take the center, you have a lot of fun gambits to play with here too, and you have a great game ahead of you. And another positive is that because of the whole anti-Sicilian nature, this will be a lot of the times unfamiliar territory for black, where for you, you're going to be playing it a lot. So you'll naturally have more experience and do a lot better. 17, I have the Smyslov variation with knight to c3, the close Sicilian, knight c6, we get a double fianchetto by both of us, now d3, e6, bishop e3, and black here launches their knight into the center with d4, at which point we back our knight up to e2. This is another variation I looked at and first thought was stupid, but then I realized it is really hard for black to play. The best move here is knight drops back to c6, which out of the about 8,000 games have been played here, this has been played 6 times. So you really know that people don't really know what to do here. They can try two things. If they try to just develop knight e7, then you play c3, and after this trade here, you have more development, you can castle easily, you'll soon play d4 and take the whole center. And if instead they try to capture, you take back and then win the pawn on b2. It doesn't quite work. You can simply play rook b1, they back their bishop up, and then you take the pawn c5, so now material is equal, plus you have a lot more development and the semi-open b file to play with, and you are doing fantastic. 16, I have the Mengerini Gambit with a3, knight c6, and b4. This is the most evolved wing gambit. After they capture, you take back, knight takes on b4. You can basically always guarantee these next few moves here. C3, knight will drop back, d4. Black doesn't want to get overrun, so they play d5 here. You'll take, queen takes back, and now knight to a3. And this position is ridiculous because the 3 most common moves, e6, e5, and knight to f6 all fall into traps, which is literally ridiculous. And even if they don't, you still have a fantastic game to play with. My only problem is that in some positions, like back here, if they don't want to accept and instead play like knight to f6 here, you're not doing bad, but it's not like a super awesome position. However, the traps in this position certainly make up for it. Number 15, I have the Carries attack with knight to f3. Black goes pawn to d6 here. d4, takes, knight to f6, knight to c3 defending. And after e6, the Schweningen, here we play g4. I just love this move. It's just no rest. It looks absolutely insane, but you are not letting black sleep for a second. You're going to go g5 and attack them. If they try to play like e5 here and attack your knight, the best way to play is to actually give this check, and after this all happens, then you can place your knight onto f5. So now d6 is hanging, g5 is still coming, and they are getting absolutely mauled. And if they try to prevent with like h6 here, you can go h4, which is super fun, or simply g5 and just do it anyways. These are going to promise you very fun attacking positions where you don't really have to risk that much and is objectively sound. Number 14, I have the poison pawn variation from the Najdorf after knight to f3, d6, d4, we trade in center, knight to f6, knight to c3, pawn to a6 is the Najdorf, and here we get bishop g5 attacking, e6, f4, and now queen to b6. With this move, we are attacking the b2 pawn, and white's only really good option here is queen to d2. A lot of people will try knight back to b3, but here we can go knight b to d7, and we're already doing great here. We'll play a bishop e7, castle, we're actually doing like fantastic already. But their best try here of queen to d2 does get a bit dangerous for us after we take rook b1 and queen to a3. Point here is kind of like a gambit for white. We're up a pawn, but in return they get a lot of development, and while it can get very complicated in my experience, this is actually great for us. It's a lot harder for white to actually attack us and finally break through than it seems, and more than likely we'll get knight b to d7, bishop e7, castle. We'll actually get a pretty good game. And because of the extra pawn, will be favored in basically all endgames. Number 13, I know a lot of people disagree with me on this. I have the Smith-Morra gambit with pawn up to d4, they take, c3 captures, and knight takes on c3. It would take me too long to explain why this is so incredible, but the main ideas here is we're going to get a ton of development, so many open lines, and we're going to be able to attack black while most of the time they will not even know it hit them. What really made me believe was Mayhem in the Mora by Mark Esserman. Check out that book if you don't believe me, but you'll see there are so many tactical ideas here that are so aggressive and so much fun. Number 12, I have the tall gambit. After pawn to f4 here, we go d5, they capture, and knight to f6. This tall gambit is the only reason why f4 is a bad move. Because, one, if they just play like knight to f3, we simply capture, we're not done any material, their pawn structure sucks because they have no e-pawn, and we are doing better. And if instead they play c4, which more people try to do, try to hang on, it does not work because we play e6. If they trade, bishop takes back, and oh my god, engine only says we're a little better, but we are much, much better in my opinion. We have 2 extra pieces developed, and white has a ginormous hole on d4, which they can never fix. You'll win so many games. And if they try like knight c3 to try and hang on, this is even worse. After takes, we can simply take again. And after everything happens, we have a queen in the middle, which white cannot attack. Their pawn structure sucks, and we're not even down any material. Number 11, I have the Schweningen variation where white goes knight to f3, we play pawn to d6, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, and now we go pawn to e6. It may look passive because we block in both of our bishops, but the idea here is we're going to play slow like with bishop e7, then knight b to d7, castle, and eventually we'll play a6, b5, and launch our bishop on this diagonal, or play pawn to e5, and there are so many fun opportunities here, while also retaining being extremely solid and relatively easy to play for how good it is. Number 10, I have the classical variation. After knight to f3, we go pawn to d6, d4, same opening as the last one, but when we reach here, we instead play knight to c6, and this one is fun because it is very flexible. From this point, depending on what white does, like if they play bishop e2, you can go a lot of different directions. You want to go more of a Najdorf, play a6. You want to go more Schweningen, e6, dragon, g6. They're all very fun, and it's nice to only commit a move later. That way you can see what they play before, and knight c6, I mean, you're developing a piece that cannot be a bad move. Number 9, I have the grand pre-attack after knight c3, the closed Sicilian, knight c6, and pawn to f4. Like I said a few spots ago in the tall gambit, the only reason f4 is bad is because of d5, which is now prevented because of the closed Sicilian. And so because of that, this is so powerful. After like d6 here, development is extremely easy. Bishop c4, d3, castle, and you're going to be having a lot of fun attacks with various f5s. So much fun, so many tactical ideas. A lot of people underrate this one, but I think it is really strong. Number 8, I have the anti-Sozin variation with knight to f3. We play knight c6, d4, trade in the center. We can now play knight f6, attack the pawn, knight c3 defending. Now we'll go d6. Bishop c4 here is a Sozin attack, and now we play queen b6. We attack their knight and put pressure on b2, and nothing they do is good here. As in, if they try to take our knight, we'll simply take back with the pawn. We now have the semi-open b file to play with, and we have more central space, potentially d5 in the future. We are doing great there. If they try bishop e3, there are no tricks really. This is a free pawn. The only thing might be some knight tricks trying to get into c7, but we can simply play b4, simply just attack their bishop, and after bishop d3, queen to a5 here, that is defended. And their best try here of backing up to b3 isn't that good either, because we go e6, and although our queen's attacked, we simply back it up to c7, and now we're playing in a Scheveningen style. We'll play a6, b5, place our bishop on b7, and we have a very good opening ahead of us once again. Number 7, I have the wing attack from the Con Sicilian after knight to f3. We're going to play pawn to e6 here, d4, trade in the center like this, and after a6, the Con variation in knight c3, we play b5. This move has two ideas. One, by extending the pawn like this, we're threatening to push up to b4, and if they ever castle long, we can go a5, a4, and we already have our pawns pushed to go on a big attack. And secondly, and more importantly, bishop b7. We're going to play that in basically every variation, target their e-pawn, and it actually works incredible here. Most common move is a3, at which point bishop b7 to attack their pawn will then quickly play queen c7. We already win like 60% of games here compared to white's like measly like 38. I mean, yeah, we are already doing very, very well there. And if they instead play just about anything else here, like let's say just bishop d3, we can do the exact same thing. Bishop b7. We'll then go queen c7, knight f6, easily develop all our pieces, castle. We have a great game ahead of us and a very nice plan. Number 6, I have the closed Sicilian with knight to c3. I don't think this gets enough love. The idea of developing this knight first to put more protection on d5 is really good. It will very often take black out of their element, and in conjunction with ideas of f4, especially in the Grand Prix attack, but also f4 everywhere, this is a fantastic way to play. And while it is more of an umbrella than a real opening, the openings that come from it I think are really strong. Number 5, I have the Schoefferman variation with knight to c3, the closed Sicilian, knight c6, f4, the Grand Prix attack, g6, knight to f3, bishop g7, bishop c4, normal development, and after e6, we play the crazy move here, f5. Let me walk you through this. First off, most people are going to play like knight g to e7, but if they try to capture here, this is how it goes. d3, black captures again, we take back. It doesn't look too crazy. White wins 72% of games here, which for move 8 is honestly insane, because after knight g to e7, we're simply going to castle. It's so simple. After black castles 2, we can drop our queen into d6. We're going to start moving our pieces in, and black has a gigantic attack on their hands that is extremely hard to deal with. And back here, let's say they get scared and try knight g to e7, which most people do. We can simply capture now. No matter what they take back with, we're once again simply going to play d3. Then we're going to castle. And here we're not even down a pawn, but black still has a very awkward position. We're still going to go on the attack, and we still have a fantastic game ahead of us. Number 4, I have the Yugoslav attack with knight to f3, d6, pawn to d4, they capture, we take back, knight f6, knight to c3, pawn to g6 here is the dragon, and here we play bishop e3, bishop g7, and then f3. The point of this move is we solidify our center, and soon we're going to go g4, h4, h5, and go on these absolutely insane attacks. Meanwhile, we will also play queen d2, long castle, get our king safe while we go on extremely fun attacks. If you cannot tell, I love attacking, and this opening really serves that purpose well. Number 3, I have the Khan variation with knight to f3, we play pawn e6, d4, capture, capture, and now a6. This is very similar to the Najdorf, but I do not see it talked about nearly as much despite it being so good. If you want to, you can transpose right into a Najdorf or a Scheveningen setup. However, I prefer to play the moves like b5. Go bishop b7, immediately start attacking them. White almost never knows what to do here. That's part of the benefit of being underrated, and along with that, we're going to be able to develop easily and castle and just have a great time. Meanwhile, white will be under a lot of pressure and basically have no plan while we are riding high and having a fantastic time. At second place, I have the dragon variation. After knight to f3, we go pawn to d6 here, d4, trade in the center, knight to f6, knight to c3 defending, and now g6. The first idea of this is that we're going to go bishop g7 and castle. Any opening where you automatically start getting pieces out and you're self-castled is a big plus, but secondarily, your other ideas are also very strong. Those being, one, you're going to try and push into the center with d5, which, if you know that idea, you're already going to be winning a ton of your games. The only thing you do need to worry about is things like f3, the Yugoslav attack, but if you know what you're doing, you can counter-attack them, which, one, is super fun, and two, a lot of the times they will get swept up in their own attack, let their king loose, and you can checkmate them very early on. There are way too many things for me to explain here, however, it is fantastic and very strong. And in first place, I have the Najdorf variation. Yeah, maybe it's the normie pick, but it is the best. It comes after knight to f3, we go pawn to d6 here, d4, we trade in the center, knight f6 attacking, knight c3 defending, and now we play a6. The idea here is we are controlling b5, so no pieces can come there, and ourselves are likely going to play b5 and bishop b7 eventually, and we're going to have a great queenside expansion. And while this opening is very complicated with a lot of lines and a lot of ideas, it is so extremely strong. If you do want a Sicilian to study, this would be the one, because in my opinion, it is the absolute best. Alright, well, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you have a great day. Become a member to support me and vote on future videos. Once again, thank you to Chess Titans for sponsoring this video. Like and subscribe for more, and I hope you have an absolutely fantastic day.